Ready for a deep dive that might just turn how you think about history upside down?
I'm in.
We're tackling imperial violence and the illusion of peace.
Uh-oh. Sounds intense.
It is. And we've got Lauren Benton's They Called It Peace to guide us.
It's a fascinating read. We like to think, oh, the days of empires, those are over. But Benton's work, it shows how their tactics, they haven't really gone anywhere. They echo through time in ways we might not expect.
It's like we assume, like progress, right? Like a straight line from this more violent past to our quote-unquote more peaceful present.
Right, like international law just swooped in and poof, less violence. But Benton, she says, no, not so fast. It's always been more complicated than that.
So there's always been this tolerance for violence, even when empires are saying, look, we come in peace.
Exactly. It's not about violence disappearing. It's about how it gets, I don't know, repackaged maybe. The real story, Benton argues, it's in what we might call the small wars.
Small wars. What are those?
The ones that don't make it into the big history books, right? But Benton argues that they were essential, absolutely essential to how empires built global order. And honestly, how it's still maintained today in many ways.
Okay, now that is interesting. So where does Benton even begin to dig into all of this?
She starts with this period, roughly the 1400s to 1900s, and this really clear pattern just pops up, raiding and captivity. But here's the thing. It's not just random violence. These were tools, building blocks for empires.
Okay, so like conquer people, take some captives, and repeat. Brutal, but effective.
Well, it's more intricate than just that. Think about the Mediterranean coast of Spain, 1500s. Raids, they weren't just about conquering. They were part of, woven into, how communities related to each other.
So instead of one big war with clear sides, it's these smaller, more frequent conflicts that actually define things.
You've got it. And this wasn't just a Spanish thing either. Benton shows this pattern raiding, captivity integration. It's everywhere. Empires take captives and then they integrate them into their social and legal structures, often through households, actually.
Wait, households? You're saying families were involved in how empires exerted control?
It's one of Benton's most fascinating arguments. In many empires, households weren't just private spaces. They were legal units, mini governments almost.
Whoa, I never thought about it like that.
The head of the household, they often had real power, settling disputes, even punishing people.
Wow, that changes how you picture daily life under an empire. It's not just emperors and armies, it's like power down at the family level almost.
Exactly. And Ben connects those threads, right? The violence of the raids, the legal stuff with households, and how empires justified it all, it's all connected.
Okay, this definitely challenges some assumptions, but why should this matter to, our listeners? What's the takeaway here?
Because it helps us understand how empires, even today, still use the same playbook to justify taking control. Benton shows how they blur those lines between lawful punishment and just outright brutality, all in the name of maintaining peace.
So by recognizing these patterns,
We are much more equipped to look critically at what we're being told today, which is crucial.
okay, I'm with you. So we've got raiding, captivity, these surprisingly powerful households. How do empires actually go from those kind of scattered outposts, to full-blown colonies?
Now that is where things get even more interesting. Let's look at the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean. They built their empire there through raiding, used the spoils to fund their outposts, to expand.
So basically profit-driven expansion. But I'd imagine all that raiding would make it pretty difficult to, establish a lasting presence.
Right, exactly. And one of their key figures, Afonso de Albuquerque, he saw this problem. He loved the wealth raiding brought in, but he also knew they needed more stability to really cement their power. His solution, fortifications.
Forts, like castles and walls, seems a little old school, even for building an empire back then.
It's easy to think of forts as just defensive, but for the Portuguese, they were more than that. Strategic tools. To understand, think about those grand mosques built by earlier Muslim traders in the region. Those weren't just religious centers, they were symbols. Influence, permanence. The Portuguese forts, same idea.
So projecting legitimacy, an image of power that was more than just brute force.
Exactly. Trying to create this illusion of peace and permanence, even if the reality was their empire, built on violence. And this is where we see a big shift. How they talked about it, how they justified their actions, it starts evolving.
It's getting good. How does that language change? What were they saying to make violence more, palatable?
Well, before the break, we were talking about how empires would try to make their actions okay, often by saying, well, their tactics are savage, uncivilized. But it wasn't that simple. It wasn't one-sided.
You mean it wasn't just European powers calling all the shots and everyone else just, went along with it?
Exactly. Indigenous populations were not just passive bystanders. Not at all. They understood the power of treaties, legal arguments. They even used those things to their advantage.
So it was a game, almost. Not just winning battles on the battlefield, but winning legal battles.
Yeah, absolutely. Benton talks about this fascinating example. The French and British East India Companies in the mid-18th century. Two massive corporations, both fighting for control in India. Trade, territory, you name it.
High-stakes corporate rivalry, but, global scale.
With armies.
Exactly. And here's where it gets interesting. Even though France and Britain had a peace treaty back in Europe, their East India companies, waging what we'd call proxy wars in India, using local rulers and armies to do their fighting for them.
So peace back home, but over in India, total chaos. It was a legal and logistical mess. Remember, these companies, they were operating under the authority of their home countries. So if France and Britain were officially at peace, could their companies still claim self-defense when they attacked? Could they just seize land, plunder ships? It really stretched those nice, neat European ideas of war and peace to the breaking point.
They wanted to have their cake and eat it too. Benefit from peace, but still use violence to get what they wanted. Makes you wonder what peace even meant in that context.
Right. And this is where we see the limits of those European legal systems. The reality on the ground, in places like India where these small wars were happening, way too complicated for those black and white definitions.
So did they ever figure it out, resolve those legal issues, or did they just, muddle through?
Mostly muddled through. Always pushing the boundaries, finding loopholes, and all that tension, those simmering conflicts. It actually helped lead to the 7 Years' War, a global conflict. And it grew partly from these smaller imperial conflicts that they were trying to keep quiet.
Wow, so those small wars, the ones we don't hear much about, they had real consequences, even shaped global conflicts.
That's exactly Benton's point. We can't just ignore them. Those smaller conflicts, often happening in the shadows of official peace treaties, they played a huge part in shaping the world.
So much for a peaceful progression of history. More like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and sometimes a sidestep into violence disguised as something else.
Perfectly put. And to show this even more clearly, Benton looks at the Guarani War in South America. This conflict shows how those legal distinctions played out with devastating consequences.
This is the one where the Guarani who were living in Jesuit missions were forced to relocate because of a treaty between Spain and Portugal.
That's the one. And it's truly heartbreaking. Spain and Portugal decided to redraw their borders in South America. And the Guarani missions, well, they ended up on the Portuguese side. The Guarani, obviously, they resisted. They didn't want to leave their homes.
And that's where that whole idea of rebellion versus war that we talked about earlier, that becomes so important.
Right, exactly. The Spanish, at first, they tried to say the Guarani resistance was a rebellion, a way to give themselves permission to use force. But here's with the Guarani, they were incredibly smart. They flipped the script. They said, no, we're not rebels. We're a sovereign people defending our land from invaders.
Wow. Bold move. Did it work? Did that actually give them any protection?
To some degree, yes. It forced the Spanish to take them more seriously, and it even got them some sympathy from some people in Europe. But in the end, they were just outmatched. The war ended tragically. Thousands of Guarani dead, missions destroyed.
It's a tragic example of how understanding the law, even having a morally sound argument, sometimes it's not enough. Not against the force of an empire.
It really highlights Benton's point. These smaller conflicts, the ones that we don't always pay attention to, they were central to how European empires expanded and solidified their power.
So much to unpack here. But for our listeners, how does this all connect to what's happening today?
The biggest takeaway: recognizing the patterns. Empires have used these same justifications for violence throughout history, whether they say they're claiming divine authority. But the goal, it stays the same. Make violence seem acceptable, even necessary.
So it's like a playbook, echoes through time.
Exactly. And if we can recognize those echoes, we can start to see through them.
So it's about becoming better listeners, more critical thinkers, especially when those in power, when they start using those buzzwords.
Exactly.
This has been eye-opening. We've gone from raiding and captivity to the role of households to how they talked about violence. It's like we're seeing these hidden truths about how empires really work.
And that's what makes Benton's book so important. It's not just about digging up this hidden history of violence. It's about helping us see the world differently, more clearly, more critically.
And on that note, we'll be right back to wrap up our deep dive into They Called It Peace. Stay with us. Back again with the deep dive.
It's amazing what we've uncovered so far, from raiding and captivity to, who knew? Households, right? Being a key role in how empires held onto power.
And of course, we can't forget how they justified it all. All that violence repackaged as peacekeeping.
It really makes you think, right? The more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah.
Which brings us to, I think, Benton's most unsettling argument. It's not just that these patterns happen, it's that they never really went away, not when those old colonial empires ended. She's saying they're still here, still part of global politics.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like we're back to, dividing up the world with swords and all that. But those same power dynamics, the ways empires justified intervening in other countries, they've just, adapted, evolved.
Okay, so connect those dots for us. How does this historical stuff show up in the world today? Well, take the whole protecting our people argument. Empires have always used that to get involved in other countries' business. Benton says that now, in the modern world, that idea has gotten even bigger, more flexible. It's not just about protecting your citizens overseas anymore, it's about protecting your interests, economic interests, anywhere in the world.
So that same logic that fueled colonialism, it's just operating on a global scale now.
Exactly. Think about how we hear terms like national security, strategic interests used to justify everything, drone strikes, invasions, these big, vague terms that can mean, well, almost anything.
And this is where that line between, what's a war and what's a police action or some other kind of intervention, it gets blurry. Like with the Guarani, right? What you call the conflict, it determines how much violence is okay.
Exactly. Benton argues that this whole thing, blurring war and peace, sanitizing violence with language, we inherited that directly from centuries of empires doing the same thing.
So it's not that we're more peaceful now, it's just that violence is, more palatable, easier to swallow.
I think that's a really good way to put it. And it's an uncomfortable truth. Benton doesn't shy away from it. Even with international law, diplomacy, all that, violence is still everywhere in global affairs.
It's a lot to think about, but it also feels kind of empowering to be able to recognize these patterns, see how history rhymes, even if it doesn't repeat perfectly.
Right. That's what makes Benton's work so compelling. It's not just about dwelling on the past, it's about giving us the tools to understand the present, to be more critical, to not just accept the stories we're told about why violence is necessary.
So after this deep dive, all this complex, often really difficult history, what do you hope our listeners take away from Benton's book? What's the big takeaway?
I think it comes down to this. If we really want a more just, more peaceful future, we have to understand how we got here, recognizing how empires justified violence. It's not optional. Not if we're serious about challenging the use of violence today.
It's about seeing those echoes, right? Those same old justifications for intervening, and not just accepting them at face value.
Exactly. Benton's book, it's not just history, it's a call to action. It reminds us that peace isn't passive, it's something we have to fight for. Every day.
Question those in power. Demand transparency. Hold them accountable for how they use violence in our name.
Absolutely. And it starts with being informed. Understanding the playbook.
Couldn't agree more. If you want a book that will make you question everything, understand history on a deeper level, and leave you feeling fired up to build a more peaceful world, Lauren Benton's They Called It Peace is it. Don't miss it.
It will stay with you. Might even change how you see everything.
And that's a wrap on this deep dive into the illusion of peace. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. See you next time.